Well, yesterday we saw the deliberate blockading of ports and infrastructure in Brisbane, in Newcastle, in Melbourne by this group calling themselves Blockade Australia. And this is an area where I must confess I am genuinely torn. I don't like to see disruption. I think it's disrespectful. I think it's rude. And I think one person being able to shut down critical infrastructure is a terribly bad idea and a bad way to run a country. On the other hand, I've personally been on the receiving end of the abuse of anti-protest laws when I was standing up against lockdowns in Victoria. So I have to confess, this is an area where I'm not entirely sure where I come down on how such disruptive, intentionally disruptive protests should be handled. So I decided to turn to someone who has observed probably more protests than any other individual in Australia. And I'm talking about Chris de Bruin, who has kindly come on, Chriscoveries, who's kindly come on as our Sydney correspondent here. Chris, now, this is the first time we've seen your face here on the Aussie Wire, but you did that fantastic and very well-received segment for us all about the closure of the Liddell power plant and its impact on power prices. So for those of you that haven't seen the face, just know that you have enjoyed some amazing content from Chris. Now, Chris, we've got some images here of these protests going down. Like I said, Brisbane, Newcastle and Melbourne simultaneously being blockaded and shut down, often by individuals or extremely small groups of people. Help me to think through this because, like I said in my intro, I genuinely don't know how I feel about what to do in these sorts of situations.
If you're looking for moral judgment, well, it's a show of force. It's a show of force of what they're doing here. That they have people within their group willing enough to put themselves in imperiled situations, and that's hard to find. It's one thing for someone to click share on Facebook and be like, "I really believe in this cause because I clicked like," or I'll throw $5, $100.
Yeah.
You're willing to put their bodies on the line like that. This is proving the belief in their cause.
Sure.
It's the same with this is any protest movement. Are you willing to get out of your chair and into the streets? And in this case, this isn't just into the streets. This is above the streets. This is in the way of choppers, fire, at truck, and very particularly at a port. So they weren't, unlike Just Stop Oil, which I'll refer back to a few times, which disrupts motorways. This is blocking ports. This is blocking the businesses. So then it turns to us to try and, in your situation, go, well, where do I stand?
Yeah, what's the right thing to do?
Kids can still get to work. We're not blocking down roads in the city, but we're blocking ports, which could be goods. This is tough, and happy to talk it through with you.
Yeah, so this is, for me, this is personal because I'm still fighting criminal charges from in my opinion, the abuse of incitement laws in Victoria because I was encouraging people to, and this is important, peacefully and non-disruptively, non-destructively exercise their human right to protest against the lockdowns that occurred in Victoria. I actively, and I've got video evidence of this, I actively worked against people that wanted to do property destruction or unnecessary disruption or these sorts of things. I always felt that we should stay off the road until there were so many of us that we really had no choice. And only then would we actually allow ourselves to block a road. This is a different beast, though. This is a very small number of people they're not actively protesting, they're actively obstructing. They're actively getting in the way. This is their intent. Now, we've seen some South Australian laws that have tried to apply very, very high penalties to anyone that engages in obstructive protest. I really find it very, very difficult to get behind those laws. I had a conversation with Rukshan just a few weeks ago trying to just begin the process of drilling down into this. You've watched more protests than possibly any other person in Australia. You've covered an enormous number of protests. Take me back a year or so because there's a protest that you brought to my attention on this as well.
No, this would, if you're talking about when I covered Blockade Australia previously last year, that was confrontational, where you had a group of people without a schedule, without informing the police, occupy a road and step into the middle of it. And I was there for it. This was the second week of protests, and they were quite determined in what they were doing. When we first got there, they were more media than protesters. I found the entire situation a little bit absurd because you've got these protesters clearly about to occupy a road and knowing what they're going to do. A gentleman yelling, "The power of Christ compels you,"
which is extraordinary,
while a media swarm goes around them. Look, it's a protests are a wild, funny place, and that's why I cover them. But this group is clearly about to occupy a road, which, without police permission, you can't just do that. Is normally the rule, right? And what we followed is we went down the streets. We wait for the lights to turn green, ridiculously enough. We wouldn't want to break those rules. But as we wait for the lights to turn green, They step into the streets and diffuse it before we get down there, but it wasn't diffused before we get down there. The blockade group of, I don't know, anywhere between 40, 50, 30, something. Then occupied the road with the same measures they had the week before. Now, something I mentioned from the week before's protest is that they hadn't just occupied the road, they were pushing those large orange blockades into the middle of it. And in fact, one of them had been struck by a car. So this is confrontational stuff. This is not COVID lockdown, you need to go home kind of stuff. This is standing in Hyde Park kind of approach. We don't agree with it. It's you have an unauthorized protest, and you're going to disrupt while it's there. So the group that is there, you can call them progressive if you like, but what they're most there is to try and cause disruption for attention. And does that lead to wide public support? Media certainly love it because the old rule, if it bleeds, it leads, works in news media, which is why you see more media here than protesters and why all eyes today were on people willing to put themselves in danger for it.
Yeah.
I'm not sure it's going to be winning public hearts and minds, but the change of tack from rather than blocking roads of people where they're going to ports and trying to hit businesses instead, well, it's not as, it doesn't get the public as offside as do streets, roads, and city streets.
It may backfire less, I guess, is one way of looking at it. Look, this is genuinely a difficult thing for me. I watch what's happening here and I think about my own time on the streets of Melbourne and how out of control things got. You used the phrase there for a moment ago, unauthorised protest. The very idea that protests need to be authorised is something that raises my hackles, because I know for a fact that the Victorian government was never going to authorise any of the protests that I engaged in Victoria against the lockdowns. The very principle of free speech is that it doesn't require the authorisation of the government of the day. Often you will be speaking against the government of the day. So there's many areas where I look at these people and I go, I disagree with their particular position. I disagree with the policies that they're advocating for, but I will defend their right to advocate for it. Until they cross into this intentional disruption, this is where I really struggle. At what point does it cease to be political speech and a freedom of speech issue? And at what point does it simply become vandalism and public nuisance?
Yeah, I think that all depends on polling. I think that all depends on the local population. At what point does it? There's plenty of protests that could happen in a park. There's plenty of protests that could happen on a footpath.
Yeah.
It all depends on this flow down from polling. Tends to be police policy, how the police see it. And in your state is very different from our state. New South Wales actually did pass some laws somewhat similar to South Australia.
Okay.
They passed laws about blocking ports. They passed laws about blocking major thoroughfares. And last year, during that same blockade Australia, there was a lane of the Harbour Bridge, in fact, it may have been two, that was shut down by a protest where a truck came to a complete stop. The protester was facing 9 months, possibly up to 18 months in prison for it. Charges were later dropped after a public furor and media got wind of it. But we have similar laws to that of South Australia. They're just going a lot further. What to do with that kind of unauthorized protest tag? Individual morality. Ultimately, what it comes down to is how much disruption are you willing to tolerate? Because in Melbourne, you have I've been on a tram down there, and the tram just came to a full stop, and he's like, I got to get off, mate. I'm like, what? Yeah, and you're like, there's a protest up ahead. I'm like, is this normal? Does it happen? Yeah, it happens all the time, mate. All the time. So they have protests all the time in Melbourne.
Yeah, but
they tend to have to go through Victoria Police, and Victoria Police becomes the arbiter of what is and is not an authorised protest.
Yeah, very, very tricky territory. And I began my coverage of this with Rukshan a few weeks ago, talking about the South Australian laws. We continue my coverage of this with you, and I'm very grateful for your time tonight, Chris. This is a tricky one, and we're going to continue to talk about this because I think this is an area where, for me, free speech is an absolute human right. We must not be messing with free speech, but there is a point where you cross over from speech into something entirely different. And I think talking about where that line is, disagreeing about where that line is, and really working through that issue is an important one for us as we move forward. So, Chriscoveries, thank you so much for your time today, and we look forward to having you back again on the Aussie Wire in future.
Thanks, Toph. See you next time.